You see the cover of the game? Yeah, this cover right here? This is a lie. This cover looks like the game will be a military sim where you control an American tank, maybe a patriotic push through World War II or something. America doesn't exist in this game. Neither does Germany, Russia, nor any other country you might expect given the cover. Instead, you play a tank in the Proton Army, making a final stand against the Q-Stein Empire. I mean that quite literally. You are a tank. Your commander? A tank. The priest? A tank. The king? Also a tank. 4 years before cars would be released in theaters, we already had a world of sentient vehicles right here. Just from seeing the game, you can tell that a realistic sim wasn't exactly what the developers were going for. Between the tanks themselves and the towns you visit, the game has an almost toy-like quality to it. There's a reason for that. Seek and Destroy was originally called Shin Combat Choro-Q in its home country of Japan. The original cover gives a much better idea of what the game has in store for us. Personally, I'd rather have marketing materials like this tell me what I should expect in a game, rather than trying to change it to fit an audience that might be tangentially related. But what do I know? Shin Combat Choro-Q is the sequel to Combat Choro-Q, a part of the wider Choro-Q series, a group of racing games based on the toy brand developed by Choro-Q. You may know the toys themselves better as penny racers. The classic miniaturized toy cars you could pull back that coiled a spring that would launch them forward when you let go. You might also know the games themselves by that name. They've had games as early as 1984, starting with a puzzle game of all things. Of course, they mostly stayed in Japan until 2001. Or, alternatively, you may know them by the name Gadget Racers, or Road Trip, because what's brand identity anyway? The Choro-Q name comes from the Japanese phrase for dashing around, supposedly, in an abbreviation for Kyoto, the Japanese loanword for cute. Once the series found its footing, a common selling point was the large list of parts you could change out, and that goes for Seek and Destroy as well. The game is based around choosing a tank from a rather large selection and finishing missions with it. And while our world's countries may not exist in the game, the tanks are based on real ones, just like the toy line it's based on. Most missions consist of some variation of killing all the enemy tanks. Each completed mission gets you money, which you can spend on one of the many parts. One of the first parts you can get is a chainsaw, and you just know the game's going to go off the rails from there. You just strap it to the barrel of your tank like it's a completely reasonable thing to do. So while the tanks may have some vague basis in reality, we're just leaving that behind for the parts, and I couldn't be happier. While the tanks themselves do have some differences in how they play, the other parts you pick have a much larger impact. To help separate them a little more, the tanks have 3 types of parts they can interact with. H allows the tank to use heavy weapons, so if you want to go all in on powerful heavy weapons, you'll need to have a tank that has H types available. B allows the tank to mount guns on its body, and T opens the tank to adding guns to the turret. Types B and T roughly correspond to the sub-weapon options in the shop. Notice that it specifies opening guns. There are plenty of other parts to fill in those slots if the tank doesn't have the type open. Some tanks are limited to only one type of part, while many allow access to 2. There is one tank that offers all 3, but it's a reward for finishing the game. Most parts aren't limited. The chainsaw, for example, doesn't have any type restrictions despite being duct taped to the turret. It's just whatever the game defines as gun. To keep you from getting stuck with a bad build, you're free to buy and sell parts without any difficulty. Selling even gives back what you bought for, so if you're not attached to your collection, you can just trade out parts at the shop. If you are, you can grind out the cost of the part you want at any nearby arena. Won't even take long. The fun of the game comes from combining the parts in various ways and seeing how they change how you play. The standard missions aren't hard, and it's easy to build your tank in a way that can trivialize the game. The best parts for doing this are fairly early in the game too. It really comes down to how much challenge you want to give yourself. Since the game doesn't have any extreme difficulty, there's nothing pushing you to feel the need to use the easy mode parts. On the other hand, since the game is made to be replayed, there's no problem with one run being on the easy side. Some parts will change how you approach the game, while some are just straight upgrades, so there are plenty of levers for changing your gameplay experience. The arena itself has a bit more challenge. There's a combat arena that's generally just as easy as the main missions. Much of it comes down to the AI. It's very simple and won't surprise you with anything clever. It's serviceable, but you'll often find an ally and an enemy exchanging shots without either even trying to strafe. With the arena just being one-on-one, any challenge is going to come from the field itself applying restrictions on how you operate. Flying parts won't be suited to an arena with a low ceiling, for example. The Expert Arena has a series of mini-games to give a little more challenge where you have to compete against a CPU trying to accomplish an objective other than killing for once. These usually have a requirement of using specific parts, or limiting certain parts from being used. In a way, they can also clue you in on upcoming missions in the story, or ways you might want to adjust your tank. The arena will have you on water before the big sea mission, for example, or a race you'll most likely lose if you've been neglecting your engine. Occasionally, these will shift to a top-down perspective, and these gave me some trouble. Something about the switch and controls just messed with me. Even the basic movement took some getting used to, though. As you could probably guess, the game uses tank controls. Forward is relative to the base of the tank, and the tank's turret can be moved independently with the right analog stick, including raising it to fire shots further out. They do at least give you a button that orients the camera to face the same direction as the turret, letting you focus on aiming even while you're moving around. There are also parts that will let you lock onto targets, so you can automate the turret a bit and just handle the movement. This occasionally gets awkward if you try to change your facing and your turret is now looking directly behind you, but it's never going to be more than an inconvenience. The sensitivity that the turret turns is also something that is dependent on the parts. I mentioned that most missions were some variations of destroy all other tanks, but there is still a bit of variety there. Ignoring the various arenas you find in towns, there's only a little over 20 missions in the game, and you won't even see all of them the first time around. Sometimes you'll be given a choice between a set of missions. Choose one, and the other will have to wait until New Game Plus. As you can imagine, this makes for a fairly short game, but one that's at least designed to be replayed. Since you keep your parts through New Game Plus, having a different set of missions each run helps with the variety. Some missions have a stealth element, which can be bypassed if you build right, or can just overpower the enemies. Some missions will change the larger goal. Instead of killing all the tanks, just take out a building or defend a place. That one actually gave me some trouble when I was getting used to the game again, because I didn't realize at first that hitting the enemy at all made them move backwards for a bit, leading me to try to completely destroy tanks while the base I was supposed to be defending was completely overrun. I figured it out eventually. Then there are the bosses. There's actually a fair few given the limited number of missions. And they're all pretty unique. They can also be a decent challenge, as long as you aren't breaking the game. Since I keep bringing it up, I should point out, if you want any amount of difficulty, don't use any of the flame guns. They do a ton of damage, and for some reason the game lets you have 2 of them. They're supposed to be balanced by having basically no range. The problem with that is that you can just be faster than everything else. The glass cannon is more cannon than glass. If you aren't bending the game over your knee, each boss brings a different challenge, and it is possible to bring the wrong build into the fight. If you don't have a way to shoot skyward, then the helicopter boss is going to be difficult, if not impossible. Thankfully, if you did equip wrong, then you can just leave if you need to. Even dying will give you the option to leave the mission and come back more prepared. Most bosses are their own stage entirely, but there are a few with a proper mission before them. These tend to be smaller missions, so it doesn't usually take too long to get back to the boss. One of them is one of the aforementioned stealth missions. Sort of. The mission that precedes the helicopter boss wants you to take out some radio towers. Now, you can dodge your way through the streets, but the town right next to it has several flight parts of various prices. Those not only make the base mission easier, but prepare you for the boss as well. There's a good chance you'll be ready for both just because you bothered to visit the town. Speaking of the towns, they're filled with NPCs, again, all vehicles of some kind, and you can talk to all of them, except the trolley, he's busy. There's some dialogue before the missions, and it's enough to get the outlines of the story. Each text box has a limited set of text, which can make a lot of it curt. Combine that with some rough translations, and we'll just have to be grateful the game doesn't take itself too seriously. The story is okay. The Last Stand aspect is a fun turn-the-tables thing, and there are some reoccurring characters, but they don't have a lot to work with. Simple and quick is what they're going for, and it's best not to invest too heavily into it. The start's about as good as the end. The flavor of it is going to come from talking to the people in the towns. It actually gives the whole thing a JRPG feel. There's a mechanical benefit too. There are a few secret parts you can get by discovering them and bringing them to the right person. I think everyone says this about the games they grew up with, but the era between the 5th and the 6th generations of consoles may very well be my favorite. Gaming had been in a stride for a while, and interesting games were everywhere. It seemed like any random idea could get at least a AA budget, and the people developing the games were just as enthusiastic to find new ways to explore the medium as the people playing the games were. Before I get too old man on this, let me clarify that I think we're currently on the verge of another era of this, if we aren't in one already. With the tools for indies getting better and better, we have the chance to see incredible ideas coming to life. I guess my point is this. Give me the weird, the strange, and janky. Give me a world of living tanks or animal computer chips that wax philosophical. Give me something fascinating and fun. Of course, the other side of that janky fun ambition is that you have to be willing to tolerate the jank. And there is, of course, plenty of jank here too. I've already mentioned the complete lack of balance and the rough translation. The balance problem is very common in any game where you have a large variety of parts to choose from, and I'd rather it be lenient than strictly enforced. If the difficulty curve is too strict in a game like this, then the vast majority of parts end up useless, and that defeats the purpose of even having them. My biggest criticism is also the most easily avoided. You can access the garage either from in towns or through the menu outside of towns. You can only save in the garage. Sounds simple. But these are two separate menus, and you can only save in the garages in towns. I lost some time because I forgot what era this was and didn't save properly. With no autosaves to fall back on, I end up losing a decent chunk of time. Really, all you would need is a little more separation from the garages in town and the ones outside. Present it as a temporary field garage, and the problem's basically solved. A better translation would just be an outright improvement. I'm not even going to pretend otherwise. However, I doubt that would lead to a substantially better story. It's just not what the game is going for. There are a few other things worth bringing up. Common to games based around vehicles, the sounds associated with that can be a bit overbearing. There's no setting for sound effects, so you have to either turn the whole thing down or just learn to deal with it. The music itself doesn't really stand out, and half the time you can't even hear it anyway. The maps are a reasonable size, but sometimes enemies can get themselves in some hard-to-reach places. This usually isn't a problem, because the maps where that's most likely to happen have a different goal than just destroy all the enemies. Even then, I never had a time when I outright just couldn't reach them. Some maps are more simple than they probably should be, but it's mostly early on. Then there's the helicopter. It's another one that's not exactly game-breaking, but occasionally it just leaves the arena. And please, just stay put. It's not that hard to keep it in the game area. The field is already arbitrary. You can make it bigger if you want. Or at least make it so it actually tries to move back in the arena and doesn't just hang there waiting. If you're trying to encourage aggression, you should be rewarding your player for getting up close, especially on the first boss. Wait, what were we talking about? Right, Seek and Destroy. Outside of that one flaw though, the helicopter is actually a fun boss, as long as you have at least some parts that can hit it. It has plenty of room otherwise, so seeing it leave the arena is actually pretty rare. That's pretty similar to the other flaws I brought up as well. This was a budget game, and you can definitely see that, but it's a fun one. That on its own is enough to make me recommend it, but I'd also highly recommend it to any future designers interested in making games that feature large sets of customizable options. There's a variety of weapons, but they only take up 3 of the 11 categories for parts. While some of these are common options in other games, like better computers for aiming, some are less obvious additions. It should be pretty easy to find the game for cheap, so why not try it out? If you have played it, or any of the other Choro-Q games, let me know in the comments. That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe, share the videos with anyone you think they might interest, and support me on Patreon if you can and want to guarantee more of these videos. And most importantly, have a nice day.